Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Melissa Fetterhoff. I am the president of the Neshoba Valley Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber has had a long time partnership with the folks at the Mount Wachusett Community College, including their ongoing sponsorship of our public policy series. Mount Wachusett Community College is home of the Senator Stephen M. Brewer Center for Civic Learning and Community Engagement, which promotes positive social change and healthier, more vibrant communities through innovative programming and partnerships. I'd like to introduce Leanne Scales and hear an update about what is happening at Mount Wachusett that you can share.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to start by saying we are delighted that today is the day that the official end of the state emergency. So our campus is working really hard to bring folks back to our campus. When we launched this, many of our students registered for online classes because, as you know, you register for college before fall. As we add courses, we're going to determine whether those are going to be online or in person. We're still, all through the pandemic, have been working at about an 85-15% split anyway. We've always had about 15% of students on campus, but our enrollment is trending pretty positive for fall. We're delighted about that folks are looking at community college. And the reason I'm delighted is I want to draw your attention to a recent report by Mass Inc. You can go to their website. I think Ben Foreman is one of the great, sort of neutral, shoot it straight, look at the data researchers. And they, Mass Inc. is dedicated to economic development and also gateway cities. So this is not an organization that's based in education or that takes a stand one way or the other on promoting education. But their new report on community colleges being a gateway for economic development and specifically workforce trends, which I know everybody on this call cares about, is a big deal. They found that folks with an associate's degree earn $14,000 a year more than folks with just a high school degree. That's number one. But what I thought was really interesting is students who enroll right away, women who complete that degree are 18 percentage points more likely to be employed than someone with just a high school degree. For men, 12% are more likely to be employed. And I know many employers right now are frustrated that they can't gain employees. And making sure that we have more employees, educated and qualified to do these jobs is important. So that's my really big talking point for Mount Wachusett today is just to let you all know how hard we're working and how important we are to make sure that there's a workforce for all of our business partners to tap into. That's it from me.
That's great. Those are great statistics. We've always known that how important you are. We've loved partnering with you over the years. Thank you so much. Before we jump to our guest speaker, we are always lucky to be joined by Matt Keswick of Keswick Consulting. As you know, Matt is our public policy guiding light, and he keeps us on track, keeping our members informed. Matt, what would you like to share with us today?
Hey, good morning, everybody. As Leanne said, today the state of emergency is being lifted in Massachusetts, so it's kind of a unique day. It's a day on the calendar, but there's also a little bit of work ahead. The legislature, I believe, is going to be in today, hopefully tying up some loose ends on the kind of lingering effects or detrimental effects of the pandemic's emergency being lifted. The outside dining, to-go cocktails, all those kind of fun things that actually came out of a bad news story will be expiring, so the legislature needs to address that. Capping fees on Uber and DoorDash, all those things have to be addressed to figure out if that's permanent or if that's just going to expire today. So legislature will be in session for that. A little bit of a sad note. I don't know if it's a sad note, I guess. Disturbing, but hopefully recoverable. The Speaker of the House had a pacemaker installed last week down in Florida. So he, I guess, is recovering at home and expects to work. And the benefit of the pandemic is the legislature can meet remotely. So hopefully they can still get their business taken care of while he is recovering. And last week, the legislature did meet in what's called the Constitutional Convention. It's basically a joint meeting of the House and the Senate with all 200 members. And they meet to discuss constitutional issues. They had a constitutional issue, which they actually moved forward to the ballot process, which we're all familiar with here at the chamber. And it's the so-called millionaires tax. So that's going to be on the ballot next November. It'll raise revenue of $1.9 billion It's also referred to as the Fair Share Amendment or the Millionaire's Tax, depending on what side you're on. Expect probably a legal challenge coming up from Mass High Tech Council, who fought it 2 years ago and won in court on the legality of the question. But it's going to be a major issue going down the road for Massachusetts as we try to stay competitive. And also, coupled with that, it's kind of a unique time to be looking at raising taxes because we are flush with cash. The Commonwealth is running a $4 billion surplus right now. The fiscal year ends in 2 weeks, June 30th. It'll be interesting to see if we actually get closer to $5 billion. And that's also coupled with the $5.4 billion that we just received in federal funds. We actually got it in one lump. A lot of states got it in two lumps. So we basically have $10 billion in the sidelines here, plus this potential of new revenue coming in. So we're going to have gold sidewalks in all of our cities and towns. As I said, the state of emergency got lifted. The Commonwealth is going to be announcing soon that they're going to be returning to work in a hybrid format. So don't expect to see all the state workers go back to their state offices. I think you're going to see the state shed a lot of real estate. People would be in at least 1 day a week and working from home and doing meetings on Zoom and collaborating and things like that. So that's something to look for as well too. And I believe those are most of my updates. Oh, one other update too. Pioneer, who Charlie is affiliated with, and the Chamber and myself have been collaborating with for, I guess, 2 decades now, was part of a letter on the millionaire's tax that was distributed widely across state. And there were 150 CEOs who signed on to it. And I think about 10 or so were actually from the Neshoba region. So it's good that the Commonwealth was well represented. It wasn't just biotech CEOs in Cambridge and Boston. So a little bit of a geographic diversity, knowing that everybody cares about these issues across state, not just within the 128 Beltway. So with that, I'll turn it back to Melissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, it was great to see so many Neshoba Valley businesses represented on that list. Today we are joined by Charlie Chippio. Did I say that correctly?
You said it correctly.
Excellent.
My butchered name it was butchered long before you came along, Melissa, but you did a perfect job.
Well, I certainly appreciate my name's definitely been butchered over the years. Full disclosure, Matt did give me the pronunciation, so but still I was so nervous.
You did great.
Excellent, thank you. Charlie is a senior fellow at Pioneer Institute, and today Charlie is going to share his view on the rise and largely uncovered fall of education reform in Massachusetts. Pioneer Institute seeks to improve the quality of life in Massachusetts through civic discourse and intellectually rigorous, data-driven public policy solutions based on free market principles, individual liberty and responsibility, and the ideal, effective, limited, and accountable government. Pioneer promotes high-quality public schools, affordable healthcare, effective government, economic opportunity, and social mobility by publishing research and engaging the public through media campaigns, educational forums, and information sessions with influential thought leaders. Charlie is a Pioneer Senior Fellow. Previously, he was Policy Director in Massachusetts Executive Office for Administration and Finance and directed Pioneer's Cheney Center for Restructuring Government. While in state government, Charlie led the successful effort to reform the Commonwealth's public construction laws, helped develop and enact a new charter school formula, and worked on state workforce issues such as pension reform and easing state restrictions against privatization. Without further ado, let's hear from Charlie.
Well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and talk about something that's kind of been on my mind for a long time. And I appreciate the opportunity to kind of get it off my chest. It's funny that you guys were talking about the millionaire's tax, because that was the thing that I was sort of going back and forth about whether I should talk about this or the millionaire's tax. But in the final analysis, I think you're going to hear a ton about the millionaire's tax over the next year and a half or so. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in this is because I believe it's a story that has just been so undercovered. So I wanted the opportunity to talk about it a little bit. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to try to keep my sort of tale of woe here pretty brief, and then and then hope that there's an opportunity for us to have a conversation, questions. I'm not sure how you normally run these things, but that would be great if you can do that. So let me just jump in. I want to start, with the enactment of a big education reform law in 1993 that kind of changed the world of public education in Massachusetts. Before that time, Massachusetts was not anything special really in public education, even by the not so high standards of American K through 12 public education. But the fact that it was a fairly wealthy state even then, sort of kept it from really being as bad as what the situation was in some other states. But in 1993, you had an unusual confluence of events when you had a Republican governor, Bill Weld, and Democratic chairs of the Legislative Education Committee, Senator Tom Birmingham and Representative Mark Roosevelt, who came together and really crafted a comprehensive education reform law that was very complex, but can essentially be broken down into a grand bargain that really amounted to a large infusion of new state money into K through 12 education in return for high standards, accountability for everybody in the system, and the introduction of charter schools. So to go into that just a little bit more detail, some of the features were the fact that students would have to pass state tests ultimately in English, math, science, and history. It began with just English and math. Science has since been added. I'll talk a little bit about history. In order to graduate from high school, there was content area testing for new teachers. There was an independent accountability office that conducted comprehensive audits of school districts. And of course, there was the introduction of charter schools. At first, the implementation of this law was very slow. There was a lot of kind of internal resistance to actually implementing the law. The test of whether any of you are my age is that you will remember the debate around whether Ebonics should be included in the English curriculum standards. So a couple of years after the law was passed, when state leaders got pretty fed up with the lack of progress, they essentially gave Governor Weld the power to rejigger the Board of Education and shake it up. And he certainly did so, bringing in John Silber, who was a president of BU and who, of course, had been Governor Weld's opponent in the 1990 election to head the Board of Education. So after that happened, the pace of implementation of the law really gained momentum. And we saw a lot of amazing stuff. SAT scores, for example, rose for 13 consecutive years. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is known as NAEP, is a national test that's administered every other year to 4th and 8th graders in reading and math. By 2005, Massachusetts became the first state ever to have its students finish first in reading and math at both the 4th and 8th grade levels. So it ran the table and in all the categories of the test and did it several times after that. In 2007 and in 2011, Massachusetts, actually as a state, was one of only 2 states to participate in something called TIMSS, which is the Trends in Math and Science survey. It's sort of the gold standard international test. Global test in math and science. And the reason the United States as a whole doesn't generally take part in this was because we don't do very well. But Massachusetts performance was stunning. I mean, in 2007, Massachusetts actually tied for first in the world in 8th grade science, which was pretty incredible. One of the things that I think is often misunderstood about the reform, and that is very important, is that the benefits of education reform were really widespread. And what I mean by that is that from 1998 to 2005, Massachusetts was one of only three states that made the most progress in terms of narrowing race and income-based achievement gaps. Between 2002 and 2009, NAEP scores rose faster in Massachusetts for African American and Hispanic students than among white students. The Commonwealth's charter schools were pretty clearly the best in the country. You had urban schools that were actually outperforming some suburban, high-performing suburban districts, and you had a bunch of national studies, like one out of Stanford that said Boston charter schools were doing more to narrow achievement gaps than any group of public schools in the country. Another interesting thing that the reform did was basically make vocational technical school students subject them to the MCAS requirement as well. And they too, MassVoc Techs, certainly, and I would imagine this is close to your hearts as a chamber. MassVoc Techs have really become a national model. They have minuscule dropout rates. They have academic performance that is essentially the same as our comprehensive high schools, long waiting lists. So that's been quite an amazing story. I think it's a pretty argument to make that the 1993 reforms that Massachusetts did and the results of it were really probably the most outstanding state-based education reform in, a half a century. So that's basically where we were in the second half of the first decade of this century. And so, there was a lot of questions about what to do next. And, again, I think this gets to the point of the story that really, to me anyway, is stunning in the degree to which it has not been covered. And essentially, what happened beginning in the second half of the first decade of the century was that began a program of systematically dismantling the reforms. It started in 2008, where you had the elimination of the Independent District Accountability Office. Later that year, you had the elimination of the Independent Board of Education. Board of Education in Massachusetts had been independent since the 1840s, when Horace Mann, the father of American public education, was actually the first chair of the board. And essentially it took the board and it put it under a new Secretary of Education and made it much more political. This independence had been really critical because, as you might imagine, it was not without some political peril to do things like develop MCAS, teacher testing, charter schools, those kind of things. And it was that insulation from politics that really allowed those things to happen. So as I said earlier, the MCAS started off testing English and math. It expanded to science, and it was the law called for it to expand further to history. In 2009, the state decided that the test was all ready to go. It was ready to be implemented. It had been developed, and the state decided to postpone it. I say that with air quotes, postpone it because they said they couldn't afford the $2.4 million to actually administer the test. Well, what isn't tested isn't taught. And what we're seeing in Massachusetts since then is essentially the destruction of history departments across public schools. And you have history being taught very often by, math teachers, English teachers, and it has not been good. Next, in 2010, came a big one, which was this whole issue about adopting these national standards, academic standards called Common Core. So on the English side, the Common Core English standards cut the amount of classic literature and drama and poetry that students read by about 60%. On the math side, there was something called the National Math Advisory Panel that had done sort of a deep dive into math curriculum. And basically, the gist of its report was that Algebra 1 is the key to higher math study, and you got to reach Algebra 1 by 8th grade. The Massachusetts standards did that. The Common Core delayed that by about a year and a half. More recently, Massachusetts has also replaced its history and its science standards with weaker standards. And then moving forward to 2016, you had what I would consider really a self-inflicted wound, which was when charter school advocates decided to put an initiative to increase the number of charter schools on the statewide ballot. I guess my insight into this comes mostly from, in addition to all the charter school work I do, but the politics of it comes from some work I do on, I also have my own little consulting company. And, one of the organizations I represent is an organization of non-union construction contractors. And one of the things you learn very early if you're doing, PR and things like that for that kind of organization is you don't ever want to fight the unions on their turf. And their turf, of course, largely being turning out bodies, you just cannot match their ability to do that. And essentially, by going to a ballot initiative, that's what you were doing. You were challenging them on the turf of, making calls, turning out bodies, doing those kind of things. And so the initiative lost by 24 points in 2016. So basically, I think where that leaves us today, and the sad irony of it, is that so much of this reform has now been torn down that, with the exception of having standards of some kind and curriculum frameworks and things like that, public education in Massachusetts looks a lot like it did in 1992. And we're getting to the point where so do the results. The results are what matter. And, a few examples, 3rd and 4th grade reading they are the best predictors of future academic success. And 3rd and 4th grade MCAS reading scores have gone down by 10 percentage points by 2013, they had sunk by 10 percentage points from their high. SAT scores are down significantly, particularly in reading. I want to pull up a couple of visuals for you. This is the scores on national test. This is 4th and 8th grade reading scores. Before Common Core, and you can see that they basically went up between 1/4 and 1/2 point a year between 2003 and 2013. 2013 is when Common Core was fully implemented. And then you see here what's happened to reading scores post Common Core. They've gone down between about a quarter of a point and about 3/4 of a point since then. Let me put up one other to show you the math scores. So you can see again here, the math scores, 4th and 8th grade, were up between a point and a point and a half each year on average before Common Core, down about a point each year since Common Core. And, look, this is the point where, if this were a late night TV ad, you'd say, but wait, there's more. And unfortunately, the more that there is really bad. And that is essentially that what I just showed you was the sort of averages since Common Core. And the bad news is that the rate of decline is accelerating to the point where in 2019, on the NAEP scores, in 2019 was the last year for which we have NAEP results. 8th grade math was down by 3 points, which is worse progress than in 38 states. 4th grade math was down by 2 points, which is worse progress than in 40 states. But was really the thing that, when I talk about how I can't believe that this wasn't covered, this is the one that kind of blows my mind. That year, in the most recent NAEP scores that we have, both 4th and 8th grade reading scores were down by 5 points each. This decline is really accelerating. And I would argue it's look, Tom Birmingham, one of the architects of the reform law, always says that Massachusetts doesn't have all kinds, it doesn't have oil or gold or whatever. It doesn't have all these natural resources. Massachusetts exists on its wits and on its education and on an educated workforce. And to see these kind of declines in Massachusetts is very, very concerning. I'll close with this. I'm something of a history fanatic, and the Spanish philosopher George Santayana famously said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I often say that I feel like too many public officials feel like their time started when they put their hand down on the Bible to take their oath of office. And I think sadly today, too many education policymakers really don't know what happened in 1993 and in the aftermath of it. And I think many of them really have no awareness that the whole thing has been so dramatically torn down to to some very great negative effect. And it's something that, as a parent, I'm really concerned about, and would love to discuss it more with you. If you have questions or ideas or things you'd like to talk about, or areas where you'd like to tell me that I'm wrong, which I'm very used to, having a couple of kids. But anyway, I just really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this issue, which I think is just something that's extremely important for Massachusetts. So thanks, and we'd love to have a discussion if you guys have questions or comments.
Thanks, Charlie. That was great. Or I shouldn't say great. That was disturbing, I guess. But thanks for putting that in context. I had a couple of questions for you.
Yep.
And, one of them comes down to the pandemic is going to affect, I think, educational scores, testing, learning for a number of years, from, the social aspect of it as well. But my 5th grader, I feel like, is finishing 4th grade this week, not 5th grade this week.
Yeah.
I think he regressed, and I don't know how you kind of account for that, in testing or in other things for, measuring. One of the challenges, he's going from 5th grade to 6th grade, different school, And I'm like, do the teachers know that he didn't learn, basic math or basic reading or whatever else? And I just wonder about, how that kind of sets us back. And then fast forward when you get to 10th, 11th grade, you're taking, SATs or you're taking the MCAS for graduation requirements. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, look,
I want to make sure that nothing gets watered down. I want to make sure it all gets put back together again instead of saying, well, they didn't learn that, so we'll just take that off the table. So how do you address
well, no, you're right. And look, I mean, you're right. There's really no way to avoid the fact that this is going to affect kids for many years to come. And I wish I could tell you, if this were, 10 or 12 years ago, I think I could tell you, well, we'll make it up pretty quickly. I obviously, given what I've just said, I have a little less confidence in the fact that that will happen. What I would say, the one positive thing I would say is I don't think you need to have any doubts that the teachers will know. I mean, they have experienced this too. They are well aware of the fact that students have not learned as much, in the last 16 months as they would otherwise have learned. And I think that they will come in, prepared to deal with that. I'm less confident that the system as a whole is in a position anymore to really sort of deal with issues like that.
It's a challenge. Anybody else have questions?
I actually do.
I do too. You go first, Leanne.
Oh, thanks. So, obviously we're very interested because that high school student is our pipeline. But I will say the history question is, I also teach an adjunct political science class. I haven't this semester, but it is notable when I teach a class called Mass and the Fed, which is the U.S. Constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution, which for our friends, the oldest one in the world.
Yes.
And it's always eye-opening to me, not only that students have a lack of basic knowledge of history, but they also have a lack of ability for critical thinking. And I've heard some criticism of MCAS for that. I've heard the test is just facts, facts, facts. We're not teaching people how to sort through. To me, if we could add the history component, you cannot teach or learn history without using critical thinking. History is a series of, political debates for one.
Mm-hmm.
And so learning history by definition teaches students critical thinking.
Absolutely.
So I think if we could add the history portion to the test, a lot of the criticism, because algebra is algebra, there's not a lot of ways to teach algebra. It certainly involves thinking, but not so much pro and con critical thinking.
Right.
So perhaps if one of the talking points for advocating for the test could be that adding history would boost critical thinking,
mm-hmm.
that would be a smart political move, I would think, for folks who want to advocate for the test.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I have to tell you a story that kind of blew my mind. And this was just in the last few years. In the last few years, Pioneer found a private donor that was willing to fund the cost of administering the history test. And the state refused to do it. So, I mean, that's
why?
Because they were afraid it would be unpopular. It's mind-boggling to me. And I have to tell you, and I'm, Matt probably knows I'm full of all kinds of opinions, but, especially in this time, when, in my view, and this is nothing but, my view, I think that, if students knew something about history, they would have a lot of understanding, a lot better understanding of what we have just seen and what we are seeing in this whole Donald Trump experience, and where those kind of things come from and where they generally lead. And, on the other end of the spectrum, I feel like if students had a little bit of history, and understood what happened, say, in the 1970s, they would they would also have a little bit better understanding of where a massive increase in government involvement in the economy leads. But nobody knows this. Nobody knows either of those things, and it is just very disturbing to me. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more.
Ruth.
Yes, and I apologize for having to ask this, but maybe in a couple sentences, what was the problem that Common Core thought they needed to fix? Like what started this whole, without another whole half an hour, so you don't have to stay longer.
No, I can answer that one quickly. The problem that Common Core felt like they need, there were two things. I will give you I'll give you the sort of general sentence, and then I'll give you the cynical sentence. The general sentence that it was designed to fix was the massive gulf in performance between places like Massachusetts and places like Mississippi. What it became was essentially a kind of no vendor left behind kind of thing, where so many organizations were making so much money off Common Core. The Gates Foundation put hundreds of millions of dollars into it. That was just one organization. To the point where it was absolutely astonishing. You had in Massachusetts, when they sort of went through this process about whether to adopt Common Core, the board had said, we're going to have 3 organizations do these. We're going to fund these. We're going to have these 3 studies done by these organizations to tell us whether we should adopt Common Core. And the 3 organizations that they had do the studies had all taken gazillions of dollars from the Gates Foundation, on Common Core. So there is the academic response, and there is the cynical response to that question.
Well, great, thank you. I appreciate that.
So, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning was the $10 billion, and there's also some additional funding that's going to be coming for the state for, I don't know if, Charlie, you call it education reform 3.0 or 2.1, that's coming down the road. But, is looking, city of Boston obviously has a lot to say about this with, the most number of public students in the state. Boston Public Schools is getting $400 million.
Yeah. And
that's not going to solve the problem, but like, I guess you could give every family, money to hire private tutors, and you could do all these wonderful things to enhance the learning experience. But if you can't change the system holistically, what do you do?
Well, bingo. I mean, that's the issue. I mean, that's the issue. Look, a year or two ago, a couple of years ago, Massachusetts, updated the funding formula and had a large infusion of new money. The new money was needed. Massachusetts had a very progressive funding system, but over time, it had sort of grown out of whack, and you had growing gulfs again between the haves and the have-nots, and that needed to be addressed. Over the history of education reform since 1993, though, what would have happened was that money would have been added, and essentially that money would, as it should have been, but that money would have been added to also buy some reforms. And when 2 years ago, when we added the money, we just added the money, and it came with absolutely no strings attached, no accountability, no reforms. And I think that's the problem.
So it's almost
I have no money. I have no problem. Look, there's nothing that we do that's more important than education. And believe me, I am not one of those people who wants to starve it. I have no problem with funding it. But I think that we also have to pursue excellence. And to do that, we have to buy reform with the money that we invest.
It's just, as a parent, there's other folks who have kids here too, but, I'm dealing with a 5th grader in public schools here. And I watched the last 6 years that he's been in school, the ratio of student teachers is creeping up, from 17 up to 23. And I think it's destined for 26 next year. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, the school budget continues to go up. And every year the school committee puts in for hiring positions, but they're not hiring teachers.
Yeah. Look, that's the problem. You look at Boston. I mean, Boston's the Boston is the poster child for that. I mean, take that, you could take that, that headquarters on Court Street and cut it in half, put that money in the classroom,
Yeah.
that would make it, there would be no harm that would come from that, and it would be a huge, it could have huge impact. Look, the other thing, I mean, this is not an issue for where you are, but the other thing about Boston, and this is so critical with the charter school issue, Boston blames charter schools for its financial problems. The problem with schools in Boston is one that's as old as time, which is that Boston has about twice as many school buildings as it needs, and closing schools is political death. So nobody addresses that issue.
Gotcha. I think we have a question.
Yeah. Yes, Fagan, you had a question.
Thank you. I don't know if it's much of a question, more of kind of some insights and experience. So I'm the assistant dean for K-12 partnerships over at Mount Wachusett Community College, and do an extraordinary amount of work with our local high schools and middle schools in particular, but with the entire school system.
Yep.
Over the past year, we've been doing some really deep dives into surveying students, alumni, teachers, staff, into finding out what school delivers, what is needed, are they prepared to enter the workforce in our greater community and thrive, right? That has been our focus. And what we have found is largely what we suspected, that the joy has been sucked right out of the educational experience.
Mm-hmm.
So much testing, and there is so much focus on Common Core. I mean, have you seen the binders that these faculty have to produce, right? It's horrific. Individualized learning is gone largely from the experience, and teachers aren't able to teach about things that they're passionate about or interested in. And that's what sparks joy, right? That's what sparks that interest in learning for students. And there is so much focus on this rote memorization, when in fact, these guys have a full set of encyclopedias and everything they might need right at their fingertips. Experts at their fingertips.
Fagan, I'm so glad you brought that up. Just one comment, because I'm old and I'll forget if I don't say it. But one comment on that, and one of the things that never got brought up, astonishingly, in this whole Common Core debate was that Common Core essentially doubled the amount of testing that students have to undergo compared to what the system that we had in place in Massachusetts. Look, I mean, there's a place for testing, but Common Core is crazy. You're
Common Core is crazy. Common Core is crazy. And so as we're looking at this data, and we've got over 5,000 pieces of data just from our local area, what students want and need and what the alumni say they want and need is far more critical and creative thinking, passion-driven learning, individualized learning, and yet financial dignity, right? Not even financial awareness, financial dignity, the ability to be financially independent.
Mm-hmm.
More hard skills around life skills is what is really being sought after. And the other piece that we're incredibly concerned about is the equity component, right? And I'm looking at Paul Revel's work over at Harvard in looking at that so our data as in Massachusetts, as you said, is going down, but still looks good compared to other states until we pull it apart for the equity component, where our students that are of color are just continuing to sink, and it is going to.
Yes. You are bringing up so many things that I'm so glad that you are, because they're right on. Now, look, that is one of the really critical things about the decline, is that if you look at if you look at kids in Groton, say, those kids are doing just as well as they did 10, 15 years ago. The decline is completely among low-performing, low-income minority students. That is who is suffering. And look, I try to be calm about this, but you mentioned the work of Paul Revel, and you're right. Paul Revel was such a architect of the policies that have caused all this, but he's right. But his recent work is right. There's no doubt about that.
So, I'm seeing those two things as really intermingled, right?
Yep.
As all the testing ramps up, our equity gap becomes larger. So it feels like, and the work that we're doing here in North Central Massachusetts is to become more holistic, is to start to individualize education more, is to empower the teachers to be able to teach about things that they're passionate about and yet still can reach those outcomes in a whole different way. So I am vehemently against adding more testing, and really hope that there's some work that we can do together to focus differently on educational outcomes in support of graduates being able to thrive and be really prepared for the workforce.
Yeah. Look, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think the one thing I would add to that is that the I certainly understand where the chamber's point of view is certainly focused, as it should be, on being prepared for the workforce. But I would also draw your attention to lots and lots of studies, lots of research that shows that if we get too much into education as workforce development, that does not have a great outcome. That basically, there is a degree to which there is a strong correlation between things like doing well on a NAEP test. Again, not a test that you're doing twice a year, a case test you're doing every 4 years, and things like doing well academically, doing well socially, doing well financially, even things like avoiding future incarceration. There is that. I think that it seems to me that the research is pretty clear that we need this balance of sort of basic knowledge and and awareness with this kind of individualization that is critical. I have two special needs kids, so I could go on and on about that. But we are not striking that balance today.
Right. I would completely agree with that. So what do we do?
I don't know what we do. I mean, I could tell you what I think that we need to do from a policy point of view, but I think it's sort of fictional at this point because the politics are what they are, and the politics are going completely in the other direction. I mean, what do we do? We get rid of Common Core. We go back to the stronger Massachusetts standards. We reintroduce this idea of accountability. I mean, I just go back to the reasonable amount of testing. Because testing is important. Testing is not just a high stakes kind of thing, right? Testing, formative assessments can be really important. There is an important role for it to play. The problem I have is that I don't see any appetite to do any of it. Again, I just go back to the fact that look, I'm a crotchety old man at this point, but the fact that this decline has been so precipitous and nobody covers it is mind-boggling to me.
So the employers, on the call and, other employers, we have a pretty big voice that, we've sent in numerous letters, weighed in on several, key votes, the legislature and things like that. But it's amazing that when you talk to, the business community, that they're all on board for these reforms. But then I don't know if it's from lack of interest, lack of effort, or if it's just, you're going up against a union that is just so entrenched that they're tough to overcome. But I don't know if the message is, we don't have the right message that we're not delivering, or if it's the execution, or if it's just, it's, not going to happen in this environment. But I just look at how challenging it is that, when you get on a phone call or you get in a meeting and everyone's like, rah, rah, yeah, let's do this. And all of a sudden it's like, you just hit the proverbial brick wall.
Well, look, I think on that one, I think we could learn a lesson from teachers' unions. I mean, look, I will be, as is my wont, I will be very blunt. Back in the day, 10, 15 years ago, when, you had Mass Teachers Association heads like Melanie Kasparian and Steve Gorey, I always used to say, I'll pay for them. I'll pay for their time to go on TV and talk, because they were not very adept politically, and they did harm to their cause. I think that what we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years is a real switch. You had a switch to people like Barbara Mataloni, who I think is wrong about most everything, but who is very aggressive and very smart. And, you saw the very politically savvy, and you saw the teachers unions do things like, for example, to sell their Beacon Hill office, essentially to finance the anti-charter school ballot initiative, and so this is a much stronger adversary than in the past. And but what they do is that they just keep fighting. They have a very long time frame. And I think in this kind of battle, I think that the reform side has to as well, because the pendulum swings, and it will always swing. And I think we have to just keep at it. I don't know what else we can do.
I guess that's sobering.
Yeah, I wish I could bring you more news this morning.
Just out there for education reform. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I want to thank Charlie for doing some, I guess, insightful but sobering education, and bringing us up to speed on where we are, or I should say where we aren't. Are there any final questions? And I don't know
I just want to thank all you for having me. I really appreciate it, and thanks for the great discussion.
And I don't know if you want to get in touch with Fagan at all and see if there might be some common data you guys could share, but love collaboration between our partners. So
sounds good. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Much appreciated. It was great.
All right.